She traveled 2,000 miles to marry a man she had never met. 6 months of letters. Every penny she had ever saved. Her entire future packed into one worn trunk. When her bonnet caught on the stagecoach door and her hair tumbled free, hair the color of copper fire, the man who had promised to marry her stopped cold. "No," he said. That single word, loud enough for the whole town to hear. He called her cursed, damaged goods, the devil's mark. In front of everyone, he threw her away like she was nothing. She stood alone in that dusty street with $17 to her name and nowhere on earth to go. Then a shadow fell across her. A stranger's voice said 5 words that changed everything. "You are not standing alone today." But what she didn't know was that this man was running from his own ghosts. And the closed door that just destroyed her dreams was about to open onto something she never dared imagine. This story will remind you of a truth that changes everything. Rejection is not your ending. It's often the universe closing the wrong door so the right one can finally open. If you've ever been rejected and later realized it was the best thing that could have happened to you, drop your story in the comments and subscribe so you never miss another story about finding your fire after the world tries to put it out. The stagecoach groaned and shuddered as it crested the final hill. Margaret O'Shea pressed her face to the window, her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. 2,000 miles, 6 months of letters, every penny she had ever saved. All of it had led to this moment. Red Willow, Wyoming spread out before her like a painting she had seen only in her dreams. False front buildings lined the main street, their wooden facades weathered by wind and sun. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys. Horses stood patient at hitching posts. People moved along the boardwalks, going about their ordinary lives on this extraordinary day. They did not know yet that they were about to witness something that would be talked about for years. Margaret smoothed her travel-worn navy dress for the 100th time. The fabric had been crisp and proper when she boarded the train in Boston 3 weeks ago. Now it was wrinkled and dusty, and felt somehow wrong for this wild land stretching endlessly beneath the August sky. She reached up to check her bonnet, making sure it was secure. Her fingers trembled slightly as they touched the ribbon beneath her chin. The bonnet was important. The bonnet was everything. Underneath that careful covering was hair the color of fire, copper and gold and burning red, the kind of hair that made people stop and stare and whisper, the kind of hair that had followed her like a curse since childhood. Witch, they called her in the schoolyard. Devil's daughter, the old women muttered when she passed. Even her own grandmother had crossed herself and looked away whenever Margaret entered a room. But Edgar Whitlock had never asked about her hair. In 6 months of careful correspondence, he had asked only about her skills. Could she keep books? Could she cook? Could she teach children their letters and numbers? Could she manage a household with economy and grace? Yes, Margaret had answered. Yes to all of it. She had answered yes because she was desperate, because her father was dead and her mother was dead, and the little house in Boston had been sold to pay their debts, because she had nothing left except $17 and a trunk full of careful dreams, and the wild hope that somewhere in this vast country there was a place where she could belong. Edgar Whitlock had offered her that place. A respectable marriage, a home of her own, a chance to start over in a land where nobody knew the whispers that had followed her all her life. She had believed him, she had trusted him. She had trusted, she had been wrong. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the high Prairie Queen Hotel. Margaret gathered her courage and reached for the door handle. Her gloved fingers closed around the brass and she whispered a small prayer under her breath. Please let this be the beginning of something good. The door swung open. Bright Wyoming sunshine flooded in, blinding her momentarily. She blinked and stepped forward, reaching for the hand of the driver who waited to help her down. Her foot touched the dusty street. Her body shifted forward. And her bonnet, That treacherous bonnet that she had checked 100 times, caught on the edge of the door frame and pulled free from her head. Margaret gasped and reached for it, but it was too late. Her hair tumbled down around her shoulders in a cascade of copper fire. The afternoon sun caught every strand and set it blazing like a torch against the pale blue sky. The crowd that had gathered went absolutely silent. Margaret stood frozen in the street, her bonnet dangling uselessly from one hand, her future unraveling with every passing second. She could feel the weight of every stare. She could hear the sharp intake of breath from a dozen different directions. And then she saw him. Edgar Whitlock stood apart from the crowd, dressed in a black suit that was immaculate despite the heat. He was older than she had expected from his letters, perhaps 50, with gray at his temples and deep lines around his mouth. His posture was stiff with the kind of self-importance that came from believing he was always the most significant person in any room. He had been moving toward her. She had watched his confident stride begin, watched his face arrange itself into an expression of welcome. But then he saw her hair. He stopped so suddenly that he stumbled. His face drained of color. His mouth fell open and his eyes went wide with something that looked almost like horror. "No," he said. The word cut through the silence like a knife. Margaret felt her stomach drop. "Mr. Whitlock," she began, "I am Margaret O'Shea. We have been corresponding for 6 months. I have your letters in my bag. I have traveled 2,000 miles to meet you." "I know who you are," Edgar snapped. His voice had gone cold and hard as iron. "And you are not the woman I agreed to marry." Gasps rippled through the watching crowd. Margaret saw women press hands to their mouths. She saw men exchange knowing glances. She saw children tugged away by protective mothers. But she could not look away from Edgar Whitlock's face, from the disgust that twisted his features into something ugly. "That woman," Edgar continued, his voice rising with every word, "did not mention that she bore the devil's mark." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She swayed on her feet but forced herself to stay upright. She would not fall. She would not give these strangers the satisfaction of watching her crumble. "Red hair," Edgar announced to the crowd, turning his head so everyone could hear him clearly. "It is a sign of corruption, a mark of moral weakness. Everyone knows this. My own grandmother taught me to avoid such women. They bring bad luck and worse character." The crowd murmured agreement. Margaret saw heads nodding. She saw lips pursed in disapproval. She saw judgment settling over every face like a mask. "I will not have such a creature in my home," Edgar declared. "I will not have her near my children or my business or my good name. This arrangement is finished." Margaret's voice came out barely above a whisper. "I sold everything I owned to come here. I have $17 to my name. I have nowhere to go." Edgar was already turning away. "That is not my concern," he said over his shoulder. "You should have considered that before you tried to deceive me." He walked off down the boardwalk, his boots striking the wooden planks with sharp authority. The crowd parted to let him pass. No one spoke a word of protest. Margaret stood alone in the dust, her copper hair blazing in the sunlight, her heart breaking into 1,000 pieces. This was what rock bottom felt like. This was what it meant to have nothing left. She bent down slowly and picked up her trunk. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the handle. She did not know where she would go or what she would do. She only knew that she had to get away from these staring eyes before she shattered completely. That was when a shadow fell across her. "Let me help you with that." The voice was low and steady and completely unexpected. A man's hand reached past her and closed around the trunk handle, lifting it easily as if it weighed nothing at all. Margaret looked up. He was tall, taller than Edgar Whitlock by half a head, broad through the chest and shoulders, with the kind of build that came from years of hard physical work. His sleeves were rolled up to reveal forearms roped with muscle and marked with old scars. His dark hair was slightly too long and dusted with gray at the temples. His face was weathered by sun and wind, lined by time and what looked like old sorrow. But his eyes, those eyes stopped her cold. They were the color of sage in summer, green and gray and warm as sunlight, and they looked at her without a trace of judgment, without a flicker of disgust, without any of the things she had seen in every other face since her bonnet fell away. "My name is Caleb Holt," he said, "and you are not standing alone today." Margaret stared at him. She could not speak. She could barely breathe. Behind her, she heard Edgar Whitlock's voice cut sharp across the street. "You had best mind yourself, Holt. Taking in damaged goods will not earn you any respect in this town." Caleb set the trunk down carefully. Then he turned to face Edgar with the slow, deliberate movement of a man who had learned long ago which battles were worth fighting. "Respect," Caleb said, "is earned by how a man behaves when the whole town is watching." His voice was calm, but it carried clearly to every ear. "You just showed us all exactly who you are, Whitlock. Do not lecture me about character." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Edgar's face turned an ugly shade of red. He sputtered something that might have been a response, but the words tangled on his tongue and came out as nothing but noise. Caleb did not wait for him to recover. He picked up Margaret's trunk again and nodded toward the hotel. "Come on," he said gently. "Let us get you inside and out of this heat. You look like you could use a cool drink and a moment to breathe." Margaret followed him on legs that felt like they might give out at any second. The crowd parted around them, uncertain now, the clean cruelty of the moment disrupted by this unexpected intervention. She did not look back at Edgar Whitlock. She did not need to. She already knew what she would see on his face. What she did not know, what she could not possibly have guessed, was that the man walking beside her would change everything she thought she knew about love and redemption and the unexpected grace of second chances. But that is getting ahead of the story. For now, all Margaret knew was this. In the worst moment of her life, a stranger had offered her his hand, and she had taken it. The High Prairie Queen Hotel was cool and dim after the blazing heat of the street. Margaret stood just inside the doorway, blinking as her eyes adjusted to the shadows. The lobby smelled of wood polish and coffee and something floral she could not quite identify. A woman emerged from behind the front desk. She was perhaps 60 years old, dressed in severe widow's black, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun that seemed designed to discourage any suggestion of nonsense. Her eyes were sharp and missed nothing. "I saw what happened out there," the woman said. Her voice was flat and matter-of-fact, carrying no judgment either way. "My name is Mrs. Collins. I own this establishment." Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but found that no words would come. Her throat had closed up tight around everything she wanted to say. Caleb spoke for her. "She needs a room, Mrs. Collins, and some time to collect herself." Mrs. Collins studied Margaret with the practiced eye of a woman who had seen every kind of trouble walk through her door. "You have money for a room?" she asked. Margaret finally found her voice. "A week's worth," she said. "Maybe a little more." "That will do," Mrs. Collins replied. "Meals are included. Breakfast at 7, dinner at 6. You miss it, you go hungry. After the week is up, you will figure something out. People always do in Red Willow." "She will," Caleb said. He said it with such certainty that Margaret almost believed it herself. "She is tougher than she looks." Mrs. Collins made a small sound that might have been agreement or might have been skepticism. "Room 12, she said, pulling a key from behind the desk. "Top of the stairs, end of the hall. Quietest room in the house." Margaret took the key with trembling fingers. "Thank you," she whispered. Mrs. Collins gave her a curt nod. "Get some rest. Tomorrow will come whether you're ready for it or not." Caleb picked up Margaret's trunk and headed for the stairs without waiting to be asked. Margaret followed him, too exhausted and overwhelmed to protest. The stairs creaked beneath their feet, and the wallpaper in the hallway was faded and peeling in spots, but everything was clean. That was something, at least. Room 12 was small but comfortable. A narrow bed with a faded quilt, a washstand with a chipped basin, a single window that looked out over the back alley, away from the main street and all its watching eyes. Caleb set the trunk at the foot of the bed and stepped back toward the door. His movements were careful, deliberate. He clearly understood the impropriety of being alone with an unmarried woman in her room. Even under these circumstances, "You should rest," he said, "and eat something when you feel up to it. The dining room serves decent food, and Mrs. Collins may be gruff, but she is fair." Margaret sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. The springs protested with a tired squeak. She stared at her hands, at the gloves that were dusty and worn, at the trunk that held everything she owned in this world. "Why?" she asked quietly. Caleb paused in the doorway. "Why what? Why did you help me?" Margaret looked up at him, searching his face for answers. "You do not know me. You have no reason to get involved. That man out there, Whitlock, he seems like someone with influence in this town. You have made an enemy today, and for what? For a stranger with bad luck and worse hair." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. His face was hard to read in the dim light of the hallway, but something shifted in his expression. Something old and deep and painful. "My mother had hair like yours," he said finally, "red as a prairie sunset. She was the most beautiful woman I ever knew, and the strongest. But people said ugly things to her every day of her life, called her witch and worse, blamed her for bad weather and sick cattle and anything else they did not understand." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "She taught me early that fear likes to dress itself up as righteousness," Caleb continued. "That cruelty always finds a reason to justify itself, that the measure of a person is not what they look like or where they come from, but how they treat the people who cannot fight back." He met Margaret's eyes directly. "What Whitlock did out there was cowardice dressed up as principle, and I will not stand by and watch that happen. Not today. Not ever." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them back furiously. She had promised herself she would not cry. Tears never changed anything. "Your mother," she said softly. "She sounds like a remarkable woman." "She was," Caleb agreed. "She raised 4 boys by herself after my father died. Worked her fingers to the bone. Never complained. Never backed down. Never let anyone make her feel ashamed of who she was." He straightened slightly as if shaking off the weight of old memories. "Rest now," he said. "I will come back this evening and walk you down to dinner if you are feeling up to it. You should not have to face that dining room alone. Not tonight." Before Margaret could respond, he was gone. His footsteps retreated down the hallway, down the stairs, out into the street where the whole town was probably still buzzing with gossip about what they had witnessed. Margaret sat alone in the silence of her small room. She looked around at the faded wallpaper and the worn quilt, and the single window that let in just enough light to see by. This morning, she had been a bride-to-be. She had been a woman with a future, with plans, with a place in the world that had been promised to her in careful, handwritten letters. Now she was nothing, nobody, a scandal and a spectacle, and a woman with $17 to her name. She should cry. She knew she should cry. The tears were there, pressing against the backs of her eyes, demanding release. But instead, something else rose up inside her. Something harder and hotter and more stubborn than grief. Anger. She was angry at Edgar Whitlock for his cruelty and his cowardice. She was angry at the crowd for their whispers and their judgment. She was angry at herself for believing that a man she had never met would see past the accident of her coloring to the person underneath. And underneath all of that, buried so deep she could barely feel it, she was angry at the whole world for making her feel ashamed of something she had never chosen and could never change. Margaret stood up. She walked to the small mirror that hung above the washstand and looked at her reflection. Her hair had come completely loose during the confrontation. It hung around her face in wild copper tangles, catching the light from the window and throwing it back in shades of fire and gold. "Devil's mark," Edgar Whitlock had called it. Margaret reached up and touched a strand of that forbidden hair. She held it between her fingers and watched it gleam. Maybe, she thought, or maybe it is just hair. Maybe it is just color. Maybe the only devils here are the ones that live inside frightened men's hearts. She did not have answers yet. She did not have plans or prospects or any clear idea of what tomorrow would bring. But she had something. A small, hard kernel of determination that had survived the worst moment of her life. She would not break. She would not crumble. She would not give Edgar Whitlock or anyone else the satisfaction of watching her fall apart. Margaret O'Shea had come 2,000 miles to start a new life. That life had not turned out the way she expected. But maybe, just maybe, that was not the end of the story. Maybe it was just the beginning. She washed her face with cold water from the basin. She pinned her hair back as best she could. She straightened her wrinkled dress and squared her shoulders. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed and waited for evening to come. When Caleb Holt returned at 6 o'clock, Margaret was ready. She walked down to the dining room with her head held high, and she did not flinch from a single staring face. The whispers followed her like shadows, but they did not touch her, not anymore. She had survived the worst. Whatever came next could not possibly be harder than what she had already endured, or so she thought. But Red Willow was not finished with Margaret O'Shea yet, and neither was fate. The dining room of the High Prairie Queen Hotel fell silent when Margaret walked in. Every head turned, every conversation stopped, every eye fixed on the woman with the devil's hair who had been publicly rejected in the street just hours before. Margaret felt the weight of those stares like physical pressure against her skin. But she did not falter. She walked beside Caleb Holt with her head high and her back straight, and she let him pull out a chair for her at a corner table far from the windows. The gesture was old-fashioned, courteous, the kind of thing her father used to do for her mother before the consumption took him, back when Margaret was still young enough to believe that love conquered all and happy endings were guaranteed. She sat down. Caleb took the seat across from her. Slowly, reluctantly, conversations resumed around them. The spell of silence was broken, but the whispers remained. Margaret could hear them like the buzz of insects, too quiet to make out words, too persistent to ignore. A plate of food appeared before her without anyone asking what she wanted. Beef stew, thick with potatoes and carrots. Fresh bread, still warm from the oven. A glass of cold water that made her fingers ache when she wrapped her hands around it. She realized suddenly that she had not eaten since dawn. Since a quick breakfast at a roadside station, 300 miles and a lifetime ago. Her stomach growled loud enough that Caleb heard it and smiled. "Eat," he said simply. "We can talk after." Margaret ate. Slowly at first, then faster as her body remembered what hunger felt like. The stew was simple but good, seasoned with herbs she did not recognize, cooked by hands that knew what they were doing. The bread was fresh and soft, with a crust that crackled when she tore it. Caleb sat across from her and nursed a cup of coffee. He did not rush her. He did not fill the silence with meaningless chatter. He simply waited, patient as stone, while she finished her meal and gathered her thoughts. When her plate was nearly empty and her hands had stopped shaking, Margaret finally spoke. "I need to find work," she said. Her voice came out stronger than she expected. "I have enough money for a week here, maybe a little more. After that, I will need to support myself." Caleb nodded. "What can you do?" "I can keep books," Margaret said. "I managed my father's accounts for 3 years before he passed. I can read and write and do figures. I can teach children their letters if there is a school that needs help. I can cook, though nothing fancy. I can sew well enough to mend, but not well enough to make a living at it." She paused, thinking. "Mostly I can organize things," she added. "I have a talent for taking chaos and making it orderly, for seeing patterns where other people see confusion." Caleb's eyebrows rose with what looked like genuine interest. "You can handle ledgers." "Yes," Margaret said firmly, "honestly and accurately. Numbers do not lie, and neither do I." He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup slowly between his calloused hands. Then a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Well," he said, "that is fortunate, because I am probably the worst bookkeeper in the entire Wyoming territory." Margaret blinked. "What?" "I run the blacksmith shop at the edge of town," Caleb explained. Horseshoes, wagon repairs, tools, hardware, anything that needs forging or fixing. The work keeps me busy enough. I have more customers than I can handle most weeks, but the business side of things, he shook his head with rueful honesty. That is where everything falls apart. Margaret leaned forward slightly. What do you mean? I mean I have invoices stuffed in boxes I have not opened in months, Caleb said. I have customers who owe me money that I have forgotten to collect. I have expenses I cannot track and profits I cannot calculate and a whole backroom full of paper chaos that would probably make you cry. He met her eyes directly. I need help, he said simply. I have needed help for years, and you need work. It seems like we might be able to solve each other's problems. Margaret's heart gave a small, cautious flutter. You would consider hiring me? I was hoping you would say yes, Caleb replied. Pay would not be much at first. Enough to cover your room and board here, plus a little extra. But it would be honest work, and I would not ask any questions about your past or your hair or anything else that is none of my business. Margaret studied his face carefully. She was looking for pity, for condescension, for any sign that this offer came from sympathy rather than genuine need. She found none of those things. She found only a man who had a problem and saw a potential solution and was practical enough to act on it. When would I start, she asked. Tomorrow morning, Caleb answered. I will come by at 7 and walk you over, show you where everything is, or where everything is supposed to be anyway. Margaret nodded slowly. Then she paused as a thought occurred to her. Will this cause trouble for you? She asked. With Mr. Whitlock, I mean. He seems like a man who does not forgive easily. Caleb's expression hardened just slightly. A shadow passed behind those sage-colored eyes. Let him choke on his grudges, he said quietly. A man does not get to humiliate someone in public and then dictate what happens to them afterward. Edgar Whitlock made his choice when he threw you away in front of the whole town. Now, you get to make yours. Something shifted inside Margaret at those words. A small, hard knot that had been tightening in her chest for hours finally loosened just a little. She had come to Wyoming expecting to build a life with a man she had never met. That plan was ashes now, scattered in the dust of Red Willow's main street. But maybe she could build something else instead, something that belonged entirely to her. Thank you, she said, for everything you have done today. I do not know how I will ever repay you. Caleb finished his coffee and set the cup down with a soft click. You do not owe me anything, he said. Just show up tomorrow morning ready to work. That will be payment enough. He stood to leave, pausing beside her chair. Red Willow is not always kind, he said quietly. This is hard country, and hard country makes hard people. But it remembers who stands up when it matters, and it remembers who does not. He walked out into the gathering dusk. The door swung shut behind him, and Margaret was alone with her empty plate and her swirling thoughts. She sat for a long time in that corner of the dining room, watching the other guests come and go, feeling the whispers wash over her like waves against stone. Some of those whispers were cruel. Some were merely curious. A few, she thought, might even be sympathetic. It did not matter. None of it mattered. What mattered was tomorrow. What mattered was the chance she had been given to prove herself, to earn her own way, to build something from the wreckage of her shattered plans. Margaret O'Shea had crossed 2,000 miles to become a bride. Instead, she was going to become a bookkeeper. It was not the life she had imagined. But maybe, just maybe, it would turn out to be the life she needed. She finished the last of her bread, thanked the cook who had prepared it, and climbed the stairs to her small, quiet room at the end of the hall. Tomorrow she would face a forge full of fire and iron and chaos. She could hardly wait. Morning arrived in Red Willow with the sound of roosters crowing and wagon wheels creaking and all the ordinary noises of a town coming awake. Margaret had been up for an hour already, dressed and ready, pacing the narrow confines of her room like a caged animal. She had chosen her clothes with care, a plain brown wool dress that would not show dirt or ash, practical boots with low heels that could handle rough floors, her hair pinned back as tight as she could manage, twisted into a severe knot at the base of her skull. It would not fool anyone. The color was still there, still blazing like a warning sign. But at least she would not have it flying loose around her face while she worked. At exactly 7 o'clock, a knock sounded at her door. Caleb stood in the hallway looking much the same as he had the day before. Clean shirt rolled up at the sleeves, dark trousers worn soft with use, hands already marked with calluses and old burn scars from years at the forge. "Ready?" he asked. "As I will ever be." They walked through town together, and Margaret felt every watching eye like the tip of a knife. Shopkeepers paused in their sweeping to stare. Women whispered behind their hands. Children pointed and were hushed by embarrassed mothers. But Caleb walked beside her as if none of it mattered, as if she were just another person on an ordinary morning going about ordinary business. He introduced her to people they passed, and his introductions were simple and direct. "This is Miss O'Shea," he would say. "My new bookkeeper." No explanations, no apologies, no mention of what had happened the day before. Margaret noticed how people responded to him. With respect, yes, but also with something else. A kind of careful wariness, as if they knew there was more to Caleb Holt than met the eye, and they were not entirely sure what it might be. The blacksmith shop sat at the edge of town, where the buildings thinned out and the prairie began its endless roll toward the horizon. It was a wide structure of weathered wood, with double doors thrown open to catch the morning air and a tin roof that gleamed dull silver in the early light. The smell hit Margaret before she even crossed the threshold. Coal and iron and heat. Something ancient and powerful, like the breath of a sleeping dragon. The forge dominated the center of the main room, a massive brick structure that glowed with banked coals waiting to be stirred to life. Anvils of various sizes stood nearby, their surfaces scarred and pitted from countless blows. Tools hung in neat rows along the walls, hammers and tongs and files and punches, each one worn smooth by years of use. Around the edges of the space, raw materials waited in organized stacks. Iron bars and sheets of metal and coils of wire, horseshoes in various stages of completion, wagon parts and hinges and handles and hooks. It was a working space, a place where things were made and fixed and given new life. Margaret felt something stir inside her at the sight of it. Appreciation, maybe, or recognition. "This is it," Caleb said, watching her face. "Not pretty, but it gets the job done." "It is impressive," Margaret replied honestly. "You built all this yourself?" "Mostly," Caleb said. "Started with just the forge and an anvil. Added the rest piece by piece over the years." He shrugged slightly. "It is not much by city standards, I suppose. But out here, it is enough." He led her toward a door at the back of the shop. A small room tucked behind the main workspace, with one grimy window that let in barely enough light to see by. Caleb opened the door and stepped aside. Margaret looked in and stopped short. Papers covered every surface. Receipts and invoices were stuffed into boxes and corners without any apparent system. Dust coated everything like gray snow. Ledgers sat in crooked stacks, their pages yellowed and dog-eared and threatening to spill onto the floor. It looked like a windstorm had blown through a library and deposited all the debris in this one small room. "I did warn you," Caleb said. His voice was genuinely apologetic. "It has gotten away from me over the years. I always meant to organize it, but there was always something more pressing. Always another horseshoe to forge or wagon wheel to repair." Margaret stepped into the chaos. She picked up a piece of paper at random and examined it. An invoice for a plow blade dated 18 months ago. No indication of whether it had been paid or not. She picked up another. A receipt for coal delivery. 3 years old, with illegible notes scrawled across the bottom in what might have been pencil or might have been charcoal. She picked up a third. This one was so faded she could barely make out the words at all. Margaret turned to face Caleb. Her expression must have been something to see, because he winced slightly. "I know," he said. "It is bad." "It is not bad," Margaret replied slowly. Bad implies that there was once a system that has broken down. This is something else entirely. This is pure chaos. This is entropy in paper form. Caleb rubbed the back of his neck. Can you fix it? Margaret looked around the room again, at the mountains of unsorted documents, at the years of neglect piled in every corner, at the overwhelming scale of the task before her. Then she rolled up her sleeves. I will need a clean ledger, she said. Fresh ink, a broom, some rags for dusting, and time. A lot of time. Take all you need, Caleb said. The relief in his voice was palpable. He left her to it and returned to the forge. Soon, Margaret heard the familiar rhythm of hammer on iron, steady and sure, rising from the main room like a heartbeat. She began to work. The hours that followed passed without her noticing. She sorted and stacked and categorized. She created piles for paid invoices, and unpaid invoices, and invoices that were so old they probably did not matter anymore. She found receipts for purchases she suspected had never been recorded. She discovered entire boxes of documents that had been shoved into corners and forgotten. Numbers were her friends. They always had been. Numbers did not judge or whisper or stare. They simply were what they were, honest and clear and waiting to be understood. By midday, Margaret had cleared enough space to set up a proper work area. She had a chair now and a small table and a lantern for when the afternoon shadows grew too thick. The worst of the dust had been swept away and she could actually see the floor for the first time in what she suspected was years. She was examining a stack of invoices when she found it. A name that made her stop cold. Edgar Whitlock. The invoice was 3 months old. Wagon repair, it said. Major work on axle and wheels. Total due $50. There was no record of payment anywhere in the chaos she had sorted. No notation, no receipt. Nothing. Mr. Holt, she called out. The hammering paused. A moment later, Caleb appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on a rag. You can call me Caleb, he said. I told you that yesterday. Caleb, then. Margaret held up the invoice. Edgar Whitlock owes you $50. This bill is 3 months overdue. Caleb frowned. He usually pays. Eventually. Usually is not a system, Margaret replied firmly. I will prepare a formal invoice and send it to him today. Payment due within 2 weeks. Caleb studied her for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or admiration, or perhaps just the dawning realization that he had hired someone who was not going to let things slide. You do not hesitate, do you? He said. No, Margaret answered, not anymore. Before either of them could say anything else, a shadow fell across the shop doorway. Edgar Whitlock stood there, his face flushed with barely contained fury. He was dressed in the same black suit from yesterday, pressed and proper despite the heat. His eyes swept the shop, taking in the forge and the tools, and Margaret standing in the doorway of the back office. So it is true, Edgar hissed. His voice dripped with contempt. You have taken her in right under my nose. The whole town is talking about it. Margaret felt her heart rate spike, but she did not flinch. She stepped forward, the invoice still in her hand, and met Edgar Whitlock's glare without blinking. Mr. Whitlock, she said clearly, you owe this establishment $50 for wagon repairs. I will be sending you a formal accounting today. Payment is expected within 2 weeks. The color drained from Edgar's face, then it rushed back, darker than before. You cannot do that, he sputtered. I can, Margaret said, and I will. Your account is significantly overdue. That is a business matter, and it will be handled accordingly. For a long moment, Edgar looked like he might explode. Then he spun on his heel and stormed out, his boots striking the dirt hard enough to leave marks. Margaret let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Caleb set down the rag he had been holding. He was looking at her with something that might have been wonder. You did not make things worse just now, he said quietly. You made them honest. There is a difference. Margaret nodded slowly. She was beginning to understand something about Caleb Holt, and about this wild land where she had landed so unexpectedly. Honesty mattered here. Strength mattered. Standing your ground when everyone expected you to back down. Maybe she belonged here after all. 2 weeks passed, and Margaret fell into a rhythm she had not expected. Wake at dawn. Breakfast in the dining room of the High Prairie Queen. Walk to the blacksmith shop with the sun rising over the prairie. Spend the morning sorting and recording and organizing. Eat a simple lunch while the forge cooled. Return to the paperwork until evening. Walk back to the hotel as the shadows lengthened. Dinner. Sleep. Begin again. It was not glamorous work. It was not exciting. But it was honest, and it was hers. And every day she could see the progress she had made. The chaos of Caleb's back office had begun to yield to her systematic assault. She had created ledgers for income and expenses. She had established files for current customers, and past customers and customers who had not paid their bills. She had sent invoices to everyone who owed money, including Edgar Whitlock. That invoice had been paid on the 14th day, delivered by a nervous clerk who could not meet Margaret's eyes. She had recorded the payment without comment and filed the receipt in its proper place. A small victory, but a victory nonetheless. As the weeks passed, Margaret began to notice other things too. The way Caleb worked at the forge, patient and precise, shaping hot metal with the same care a sculptor might use with clay. The way customers spoke to him, with respect and something that looked almost like affection. The way he remembered names and faces, and the details of conversations from months or years before. She noticed the way he fixed things for people who could not pay, accepting eggs or vegetables or promises instead of money. The way he slipped coins into the pockets of those who needed them most. The way he listened when people needed to talk and stayed quiet when they needed silence. She noticed, too, the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she was not watching. A look she could not quite interpret. Curiosity, maybe, or something deeper and more complicated. Then one evening, as they walked back toward town together, Caleb cleared his throat. "There is a dance this Saturday," he said. "Out at the Clearwater barn. The whole town usually turns up." Margaret felt her stomach tighten. "I am not sure that would be wise. People are still talking about what happened when I arrived." "People are always talking about something," Caleb replied. "If it is not you, it will be someone else. Besides," he glanced at her sideways, "it might do you good to show them that you are not going to hide away." Margaret considered this. She had been avoiding social situations since her arrival, keeping her head down, doing her work, trying not to draw any more attention to herself than necessary. But she could not hide forever. She knew that. Sooner or later she would have to face this town and make them see her as something other than a scandal. "Will you be there?" she asked. "I will," Caleb said. "And you will not have to face it alone. I will be right beside you the whole time." Something warm spread through Margaret's chest at those words, something that felt almost like hope. "All right," she said. "I will go." Saturday arrived wrapped in heat and nervous anticipation. Margaret stood before the small mirror in her hotel room, examining her reflection with critical eyes. The dress she wore was borrowed from Mrs. Collins, a simple green gown that had once belonged to the hotelier's daughter before she married and moved away. It was slightly out of fashion and a little loose in the waist, but the color was perfect. It deepened Margaret's pale skin and turned her copper hair from something shocking into something almost beautiful. Almost. She pinned her hair up as best she could, weaving small white flowers into the arrangement. A gift from Mrs. Morrison, the doctor's wife, who had stopped by that afternoon with advice and encouragement and a fierce determination to see Margaret succeed. "This town needs shaking up," Mrs. Morrison had declared. "You are just the woman to do it." Margaret was not so sure about that, but she was going to try. At 6 o'clock, a knock sounded at her door. Caleb waited in the hallway, hat in hand, dressed in a clean shirt and dark vest. He looked nervous, which was strange. She had never seen him look nervous before. "You look," he started. Then he stopped and tried again. "You look beautiful." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. Thank you. You clean up well yourself. They rode out to the Clearwater barn in Caleb's wagon, watching the sky melt into shades of gold and rose as the sun sank toward the horizon. The air was warm and soft, carrying the scent of wildflowers and fresh-cut hay. Music drifted toward them long before they arrived. Fiddles and harmonicas and the steady thump of feet against wooden floors. Lanterns glowed in the open doors of the barn, spilling warm light into the gathering dusk. As they entered, conversation stumbled and slowed. Heads turned. Whispers stirred. Margaret felt every stare like the point of a needle. But Caleb's hand rested lightly at the small of her back, steady and warm. An anchor in uncertain waters. Then Mrs. Morrison swept in like a force of nature. "There you are," she announced, linking her arm through Margaret's. "I was beginning to think this dance would start without any real excitement." She steered Margaret around the barn, making introductions with the skill of a born diplomat. "This is Miss O'Shea," she would say to each cluster of townspeople. "She has been organizing Caleb's books, and I hear the shop has never run so smoothly. We are lucky to have her." Not everyone was welcoming. Some faces remained cold, some whispers continued behind raised fans. But others smiled genuine smiles, and a few even offered words of encouragement. "You stood up well that first day," one older woman told her. "That takes grit. This country respects grit." When the music struck up lively and fast, Caleb appeared at Margaret's elbow. "Would you dance with me?" he asked. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. She had not danced in years, not since her father taught her the waltz in their small Boston parlor, back when life was simple and the future seemed bright. "I am not sure I remember how," she admitted. Caleb smiled. "Just follow my lead." On the dance floor, something remarkable happened. Caleb was not a graceful dancer, not polished or elegant, but he was sure. His hand at her waist was steady, his steps confident and clear. He led her through the movements with patient certainty. And after a few stumbling moments, Margaret felt herself begin to relax. She was dancing in front of the whole town, with a man who looked at her like she was the only person in the room. She laughed. The sound surprised her as much as it surprised him. It bubbled up from somewhere deep inside her, bright and unexpected, and Caleb's face broke into a grin that transformed his weathered features. "There you are," he said softly. "I was wondering when you would come out of hiding." Margaret did not understand what he meant, but she did not ask. They danced 3 songs together before the spell was broken. Edgar Whitlock pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with whiskey and wounded pride. He stopped directly in front of them, swaying slightly, his eyes fixed on Margaret with something that looked almost like hatred. "Well, well," he sneered, loud enough for half the barn to hear. "The witch and the blacksmith. How charming." The music stumbled and stopped. Every eye in the barn turned toward them. Margaret felt fear flash through her body, cold and sharp. But it burned away almost instantly, replaced by something fiercer. Something that had been building inside her for weeks. Before Caleb could step forward, before anyone else could intervene, Margaret moved. "You rejected me," she said. Her voice rang clear and strong in the sudden silence. "That was your choice. Your right. You looked at me and saw something to fear, something to despise. That is your business, and I have no control over what you think." She took a step closer to Edgar, close enough to see the broken veins in his cheeks and the uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "But you do not get to decide what I become after you threw me away," she continued. "You do not get to dictate my future. You saw a curse when you looked at me. Caleb Holt saw a woman worth knowing. That difference says everything about both of you, and nothing at all about me." The silence stretched out, thick and heavy. Edgar's mouth worked, but no words came out. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, a woman's voice called out. "Well said." Another voice joined it, and another. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the barn like wind through wheat. Edgar's face crumpled. He backed away, stumbling over his own feet, and pushed through the crowd toward the door. The music started again, louder than before. People began to dance, to talk, to laugh. The moment passed, absorbed into the flow of the evening. Caleb was looking at Margaret with something close to wonder in his eyes. "That was brave," he said quietly. Margaret met his gaze and held it. "No," she said. "That was just me being done with being afraid." And for the first time in as long as she could remember, she knew it was true. The ride home from the dance was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. Softer, more comfortable. Like the silence between two people who no longer felt the need to fill every moment with words. The stars spread across the Wyoming sky like scattered diamonds, more stars than Margaret had ever seen in Boston. The horses moved at an easy pace, their hooves making soft sounds against the packed dirt road. The cool night air carried the scent of sage and wildflowers. Caleb was the first to break the silence. "You surprised me tonight," he said. Margaret turned to look at him. His profile was silhouetted against the starlit sky, strong and weathered and somehow comforting. "I surprised myself," she admitted. "You should not have had to do that alone," Caleb said. "I should have stepped in sooner. I should have been the one to confront him." "No," Margaret shook her head firmly. "That would have made it about you defending me. This way it was about me defending myself. There is a difference." Caleb considered this. Then he nodded slowly. "You are right," he said. "You usually are. I am starting to notice." Margaret felt a smile tug at the corner of her mouth. "Only about some things." They rode on in comfortable silence for a while longer. The lights of Red Willow came into view ahead, warm glows in the darkness. Then Caleb spoke again, and his voice was different now, lower, heavier with something he had been carrying for a long time. "There is something I need to tell you," he said. "About who I am. About why I came to Red Willow. About what I left behind." Margaret felt her heart rate quicken. She had sensed there was something in Caleb's past, something painful that he kept carefully hidden, but she had not pushed. She had learned long ago that some wounds needed time before they could be shown to the light. "You do not have to tell me anything," she said softly. "I know, but I want to." He took a deep breath, let it out slowly. "I was married once, back in Kansas. Her name was Sarah." Margaret went very still. "We had a little farm outside Topeka," Caleb continued. "A house I built with my own hands. A garden she planted with flowers from her mother's place. We were happy. Really happy the way you are when you are young and you think nothing bad can ever touch you." His voice caught just for a moment. "She was carrying our first child when the cholera came through. It swept through the whole county that summer, took out whole families, whole towns, some places." Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth. "I watched her die," Caleb said, held her hand through the night while she burned with fever. "And then, just before dawn, when I thought the worst was over, she looked at me with those beautiful eyes and she said she was sorry. She was sorry she could not stay." Tears were sliding down Margaret's cheeks now. She could not have stopped them if she wanted to. "The baby came that night," Caleb said. "Too early, too small. I held her in my hands, this tiny, perfect creature, and I watched her take 3 breaths. Just 3. And then she was gone too." His hands tightened on the reins. "I buried them together under the big oak tree behind our house, and then I sold everything, the farm, the tools, every piece of furniture we had picked out together. I packed what I could carry and I left, and I have been running ever since." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The horses walked on, patient and steady. "How long ago?" Margaret finally asked. 7 years, Caleb answered. 7 years of moving from town to town. Never staying long enough to get attached to anyone. Never letting myself care too much about anything. I thought if I kept moving, the grief could not catch up with me." Margaret reached across the space between them and took his hand. His fingers were rough with calluses, warm despite the cool night air. "We all run from something," she said quietly, "or toward something, sometimes both at the same time." Caleb turned to look at her. In the starlight, his eyes were bright with tears he was too proud to shed. "When you stepped off that stagecoach," he said, hair blazing like fire, "I felt something shift inside me. For the first time in 7 years, I did not want to keep running. I wanted to stand still. I wanted to see what might happen if I stopped trying to escape the past. Margaret squeezed his hand. "I am glad you stayed," she said. "So am I," Caleb replied. They stopped outside the hotel. The street was quiet, most of Red Willow already asleep. A single lamp burned in Mrs. Collins's window, keeping watch over the night. "I do not want to rush you," Caleb said carefully. "You have already had your whole life turned upside down. You came here expecting one thing and got something completely different. I would not add to that burden." Margaret looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had defended her when she was at her lowest, who had offered her work when she had nothing, who had shared his deepest grief because he trusted her enough to hold it gently. "What if I am ready?" she asked softly. The question hung between them like a spark waiting to catch fire. "Then we take it slow," Caleb said. "Careful and honest, the way things ought to be done." "I would like that," Margaret said. "I would like that very much." She did not know exactly what the future held. She did not know if she would stay in Red Willow forever, or if some unexpected turn would carry her somewhere else entirely. But she knew this. She was no longer running, either. For the first time in years, both of them had found a reason to stay. Weeks turned into months. Summer softened into autumn, the prairie grasses fading from green to gold. The leaves on the cottonwood trees along the creek turned yellow and red, painting the landscape in colors that matched Margaret's hair. The blacksmith shop thrived under Margaret's careful management. The books were clean now, the accounts balanced, every invoice tracked and collected on time. Customers came more often than before, knowing their orders would be handled properly. Word spread to neighboring towns that Caleb Holt's shop was the best place for metalwork within 100 miles. Caleb worked longer hours than ever, his reputation growing alongside the business. He took on an apprentice, a quiet young man named Thomas, who had arrived in Red Willow with nothing but calloused hands and a willingness to work. Margaret added him to the payroll and taught him how to track his earnings. The whispers about her hair faded slowly into the background noise of daily life. She was still the woman with the devil's mark, still the bride who had been rejected in the street. But she was also the woman who had stood up to Edgar Whitlock at the barn dance, the woman who had turned chaos into order, the woman who walked through town with her head high and did not flinch from anyone's stare. Some people would never accept her. She understood that. But others had begun to see her differently. And Caleb. Caleb saw her most clearly of all. They walked together in the evenings now after the shop was closed and the day's work was done, along the creek where willows bent over the water like supplicants at prayer, through the open prairie where the grass whispered secrets to the wind, up to the small hill overlooking town where you could see the sunset paint the sky in colors too beautiful for words. They talked about everything and nothing, about books they had read and places they had been, about dreams they still held and fears they were learning to release, about the future that was taking shape between them, careful and slow, like something precious being built by patient hands. One evening, as they sat on a fallen log by the creek, Caleb took Margaret's hand. "I have been thinking," he said. "About what?" Margaret asked. "About the shop," he replied. "About expanding, building a proper hardware store alongside the forge. This town is growing, and it will need more than horseshoes and wagon repairs. It will need tools and nails and hinges and locks, all the things a growing community requires." Margaret nodded. She had been thinking similar thoughts herself. The numbers supported it. The demand was there. "It would be a lot of work," she said. "Too much for one person," Caleb agreed. He looked at her, his eyes warm in the fading light. "That is why I am asking if you would want to do it with me. Not just as my bookkeeper, as my partner." Margaret's heart beat faster. "Partner," she repeated carefully. "In everything," Caleb said. "Business, life, whatever comes next." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "I know this is sudden," Caleb said. "I know we have only known each other a few months. But I also know that time is not always the measure of what matters. Sometimes you meet someone and you just know that they are supposed to be part of your story. He opened the box. Inside was a ring, a simple gold band with a small red stone that caught the last light of the setting sun like a tiny flame. "Margaret O'Shea," Caleb said, "will you marry me?" The word yes was on her lips. She could feel it there, waiting to leap out. But before she could speak, the sound of hoofbeats interrupted them. A rider was coming fast along the creek road. A man in a brown coat, riding a lathered horse. He pulled up short when he saw them and dismounted in a single fluid motion. "Caleb Holt," the man called out. Caleb stood slowly, his whole body tensing. Margaret saw something flash across his face. Fear. The kind of fear that comes from recognizing a danger you thought you had outrun. "I am Caleb Holt," he replied. His voice was steady, but Margaret could hear the strain beneath it. "What is this about?" The man reached into his coat and pulled out a badge. "Federal Marshal," he said. "Name is Crawford. I need to ask you some questions about a death back in Kansas. A man named Thomas Crane." Margaret watched Caleb's face go pale. She watched his hands clench at his sides. She watched 7 years of running crash into the present moment with the force of a locomotive. "I did not kill Thomas Crane," Caleb said quietly. "I was not even in town when it happened. I was at my farm, burying my wife and daughter." The marshal studied him for a long moment. His eyes were sharp and missed nothing. "I know," he said finally. Caleb blinked. "What?" "I know you did not kill him." The marshal reached into his coat again and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "A man named William Farrow died 2 weeks ago in Topeka. Before he passed, he made a deathbed confession. Said he killed Thomas Crane in a dispute over a horse 7 years ago. Said he let folks blame you because you had already left town and he figured no one would care enough to look for the truth." He handed the paper to Caleb. "This clears your name officially," the marshal said. "I came out here myself to tell you in person because I figured you deserved that much. You have been running from a ghost, Mr. Holt. That ghost is gone now." Caleb unfolded the paper with trembling hands. Margaret watched him read it, watched 7 years of fear and doubt and hiding begin to crumble away. Then he sagged, like a man who had been carrying a boulder and had finally been allowed to set it down. "7 years," he whispered. "7 years. I thought they might come for me." Margaret crossed to him and put her hands on his arms. "It is over now," she said softly. "You are free." The marshal mounted his horse. "I will be on my way," he said. "Just wanted to deliver the news in person. Take care of yourself, Mr. Holt." He rode off into the gathering dusk. Caleb and Margaret stood alone by the creek, the ring box still clutched in his hand. "I should have told you," he said. "Before. I should have trusted you with all of it." "You told me who you are," Margaret replied. "Every day and everything you do." That was enough. That was always enough. She took his face in her hands and looked into his eyes. "Yes," she said. Caleb blinked. "What?" "You asked me a question before we were interrupted. The answer is yes." His face broke into a smile that seemed to light up the whole twilight world around them. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly. Then he kissed her, and the stars came out overhead like witnesses to a promise that would last for the rest of their lives. The news spread through Red Willow faster than wildfire through dry grass. By the next morning, everyone knew. The blacksmith was marrying the woman with the devil's hair. The man who had defended her was making her his wife. Reactions were mixed, as Margaret had expected. Some folks shook their heads and predicted disaster. "That color brings bad luck," they muttered. "He will regret it before the year is out." Others offered cautious congratulations, waiting to see how things would unfold before committing to a position. But a surprising number of townspeople seemed genuinely pleased. Mrs. Morrison arrived at the hotel the very next day with a notebook full of plans and a determination to organize the wedding herself. Mrs. Collins unbent enough to offer Margaret the best room in the hotel for free until the ceremony. Even the pastor's wife, who had been notably cool since Margaret's arrival, stopped by with a basket of fresh-baked goods and an awkward but sincere offer of assistance. Red Willow was changing, Margaret realized. Or perhaps she was changing it. The wedding was set for the first Saturday in October. There was much to do and not nearly enough time to do it, but somehow everything came together. The dress was the hardest part. Margaret had brought her mother's wedding gown all the way from Boston, packed carefully in the bottom of her trunk through every mile of that long journey. It was ivory silk, softened by time, with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. She had almost sold it twice during the dark days after her parents died. Both times something had stopped her. Now she understood why. Some things are meant to be kept for the moments when they matter most. Mrs. Morrison and Mrs. Collins fussed over the alterations, taking in seams and adjusting hems until the dress fit like it had been made for Margaret alone. They wove tiny white flowers into her copper hair and dabbed perfume behind her ears, and told her she was beautiful until she almost believed it. On the morning of the wedding, Margaret stood before the mirror in her hotel room and looked at her reflection. The woman looking back at her was almost unrecognizable. Not because of the dress or the flowers or the careful arrangements of the past weeks, but because of something deeper, something in her eyes. She looked like a woman who knew exactly who she was and was no longer afraid for anyone to see it. The church was packed to overflowing. Every pew was filled and people stood along the walls and crowded into the doorway. It seemed like the entire town had turned out to witness this moment. Margaret walked down the aisle alone. She had no father to give her away, no family left anywhere in this world. But she was not lonely. She was surrounded by people who had come to matter to her over these past months. Mrs. Morrison dabbing at her eyes in the front pew. Mrs. Collins trying to hide her emotions behind her usual stern expression. Thomas, the apprentice, looking young and serious in his Sunday best. And at the altar, waiting for her with eyes that never wavered, stood Caleb. He was dressed in a new suit that Mrs. Morrison had insisted on buying for him as a wedding gift. His hair was combed back, and his boots were polished, and his hands were clasped in front of him so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. But his face was full of a joy so deep and quiet that it took Margaret's breath away. She reached him and took his hands, and the pastor began to speak. The words washed over her like music, familiar and ancient and full of meaning. She heard promises being asked and answered. She heard blessings being invoked. She heard the whole weight of tradition and hope and faith being wrapped around them like a mantle. When the moment came, Caleb's voice was sure and strong. "I do." And Margaret's answer rang clear and proud through the little church. "So do I." Caleb lifted her veil and kissed her, gentle and certain, and the congregation erupted in cheers that shook the rafters. The reception lasted well into the night. There was food and music and dancing under strings of lanterns hung from the beams of the Clearwater barn. Margaret danced with Caleb and then with Thomas, and then with half the men in town who suddenly wanted to wish her well. Even Edgar Whitlock came. He stood at the edges of the celebration, nursing a glass of punch, looking diminished somehow, smaller than he had seemed that terrible day on the main street. When Margaret's eyes met his across the room, he gave a small nod. Not friendship exactly, but acknowledgement. A recognition that the story had not ended the way he had expected. Margaret nodded back. It was enough. As the stars came out and the celebration wound down, Caleb lifted Margaret into his wagon and drove her out to the little house by the creek. Their house now. The house where they would build their life together. Lantern light glowed in the windows. Someone had come ahead to start a fire and lay fresh flowers on the table. The small room smelled of wood smoke and roses. Caleb carried her across the threshold, laughing when she protested that she was perfectly capable of walking. "Tradition," he said. "Some things have to be done properly." He set her down in the middle of the main room and looked around at the simple furnishings, the clean swept floors, the fire crackling warmly in the hearth. "Welcome home, Mrs. Holt," he said softly. Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes, happy tears for once, the kind that come when something you hardly dared to hope for finally comes true. "Thank you," she said, "for seeing me that first day, for standing up when no one else would, for giving me a chance to become the person I was always supposed to be." Caleb pulled her close and rested his chin on the top of her head. "Thank you for staying," he replied, "for choosing this life, for choosing me." Outside, the creek murmured its endless song. The cottonwood trees whispered secrets to the night wind. And somewhere in the vast darkness of the Wyoming prairie, a new chapter was beginning. Margaret O'Shea had come west to find a husband. Instead, she had found herself. And in finding herself, she had found something far more precious than anything she had ever imagined. She had found home. 5 years passed like water flowing downhill, swift and steady, and impossible to stop. Red Willow grew into something more than the dusty frontier town Margaret had first seen from the window of a stagecoach. The railroad came, bringing noise and strangers and opportunity. New buildings rose alongside the old. The population doubled, then tripled. What had once been a collection of wooden storefronts became a proper town with a bank and a school and 3 different churches. The blacksmith shop expanded just as Caleb had dreamed. 3 buildings now where there had once been one. The original forge still stood at the center, its fire never quite going out, but around it had grown a hardware store and a tool supply and a warehouse for the growing inventory. Caleb had hired 4 men and was training 2 more. Margaret ran the books for all of it. Not just the shop anymore, but for half the businesses in town. People had learned to trust her judgment, her accuracy, her absolute unwillingness to let a single penny go unaccounted for. Women who had once whispered about her devil's hair now came to her for advice on managing household finances. Men who had once looked at her with suspicion now tipped their hats when she passed. Red Willow had accepted Margaret O'Shea, and Margaret O'Shea had transformed Red Willow. But the greatest transformations happened within the little house by the creek. James came first, born in the early spring of their 2nd year. He arrived screaming at the top of his lungs, red-faced and furious at being thrust into the world. His hair, when it finally grew in thick and full, was the exact color of his mother's, copper fire that caught every light. Caleb wept when he held his son for the first time, great heaving sobs that shook his whole body. 7 years of grief for the child he had lost came pouring out, mingled with joy for the child he now held in his arms. Sarah came 2 years later, named for the wife Caleb had buried under the oak tree in Kansas. She had her father's dark hair and her mother's stubborn chin and eyes that saw everything and missed nothing. And then came the twins, William and Rose, arriving together like they could not bear to be apart. The house that had once seemed perfectly sized suddenly felt much too small. They built an addition, then another. The little house by the creek grew into something sprawling and chaotic and full of life. Margaret sometimes stood on the porch in the early morning before the children woke and marveled at what her life had become. She thought about the woman who had stepped off that stagecoach 5 years ago with nothing but $17 and a trunk full of broken dreams. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone she had known briefly and then outgrown. The whispers about red hair had faded into nothing. When newcomers arrived in town and made comments about the Holt children's coloring, they were quickly corrected. "That is Mrs. Holt you are talking about," the old-timers would say, "and her hair is the best thing that ever happened to this town." One evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, young James tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mama," he said, "tell us the story." "Which one?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer. "The one about the lady who came on the stagecoach," James said, "the one with the hair like fire." The other children joined in, begging and pleading until Margaret laughed and held up her hands in surrender. "All right," she said. "Settle down and I will tell it." They gathered close, these 4 small people who had made her life so full. Caleb leaned against the doorframe, a smile playing at the corner of his mouth. Once upon a time, Margaret began, a woman traveled 2,000 miles across this great country to start a new life. She was scared and hopeful, and completely wrong about what was waiting for her. The children giggled. They loved this part. The man she came to marry took one look at her, Margaret continued, and turned away in disgust. He said terrible things about her, called her cursed and corrupted. In front of the whole town, he threw her away like she was worthless. Boos from the children, hisses of disapproval. But another man stepped forward, Margaret said. Her eyes met Caleb's across the room. A brave man, a kind man. He did not see anything wrong with her. He only saw someone who needed help, someone worth knowing. "Papa!" the children cried. "Papa was the brave man." Caleb shrugged, that familiar modest gesture. "I just called it like I saw it." Margaret pulled her youngest, little Rose, onto her lap. "The woman learned something important that day," she said softly. "She learned that rejection can be a gift. She learned that the people who truly matter will see you for who you really are. And she learned that fire is not something to fear." She looked at each of her children in turn, at their bright faces and eager eyes, at the hair that burned like flame on two of their heads and lay dark and smooth on two others. "Fire is what forges the things that last," Margaret finished. "Remember that, little ones. The things that burn the brightest are often the things that endure." Years later, when the children were grown and gone to lives of their own, Margaret stood at the edge of town on a quiet October evening. The sun was sinking toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold, the same colors that had marked her all her life. Now they felt like home. Behind her, red willow stretched and sprawled in ways she never could have imagined when she first arrived. Electric lights glowed in windows where oil lamps once flickered. Automobiles rumbled down streets that used to know only horses and wagons. The world had changed, and Red Willow had changed with it. But some things remained constant. The forge still stood at the edge of town, though James ran it now. The same fire that Caleb had tended for 40 years still burned at its heart. The same anvil still rang with the sound of hammer on iron. Some things were too important to let go. Caleb joined her on the hill, moving slower than he used to, his hair entirely silver now. He slipped his arm around her shoulders and stood beside her, watching the sunset. "You are thinking again," he said. "I was remembering," she replied. "The scared young woman who stepped off that stagecoach all those years ago. She seems like someone else entirely." "She was," Caleb agreed, "and she was also you. All the strength you have shown, all the things you have built and overcome, they were always inside you. It just took the right circumstances to bring them out." Margaret leaned into him. What would have happened, she wondered aloud, if Edgar Whitlock had been a different kind of man? If he had kept his promise? Caleb considered the question the way he always did, thoughtfully and without haste. "Then you would have married him," he said finally. "And I would have kept running from my past. And neither of us would have found our way to each other." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Some doors only open when others close," he said. "That is just how life works." Margaret nodded slowly. She thought about all the closed doors that had led her here. Her parents' deaths, the sale of her childhood home, the long journey west, the humiliation in the street. Every closed door had led to an open one. Every loss had eventually become a gain. It had taken her years to understand that pattern, but now she could see it clearly. They walked back toward town together, hand in hand. The streets were quiet in the evening light. Old friends called greetings from porches. Children played in yards that had once been empty prairie. That night, after Caleb had fallen asleep, Margaret sat by the window and wrote a letter. Not to anyone in particular, just to the universe, perhaps, or to her younger self. "Dear Margaret," she wrote, "I know you are scared. I know you think your life is over, but I promise you this. The worst day of your life is going to become the first day of something beautiful. Hold on, keep going. The best is still to come." She folded the letter and tucked it into the family Bible. Maybe someday a granddaughter would find it. Maybe it would help some other young woman facing her own closed doors. Or maybe it was just for her, a reminder of how far she had traveled, of everything she had survived and everything she had become. Margaret O'Shea had come west seeking safety. She found something far better. She found belonging. She found purpose. She found love forged in fire and made stronger by every trial it endured. And in a land that once feared her flame, she had become its light. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.